Hey, welcome back. Today I'll be continuing my exploration of fusion cuisine by combining two celebrated cuisines in a bit of an unorthodox way. Gnocchi alla korma is my attempt at combining a bold, creamy cashew korma with pillowy gnocchi fried in sage brown butter. Should be interesting to say the least. Let's get started by placing a sauté pan on the stove over medium heat and melting a couple tablespoons of clarified butter. Once the butter is melted and shimmering, add in a cinnamon stick, 3 bay leaves, a few cloves, a couple teaspoons of cumin seeds, and a couple teaspoons of crushed coriander seeds. Let those get aromatic so that they infuse into the butter. Then we can go in with a thinly sliced onion. Sauté that until it softens up and starts to take on some color. And if it's looking dry, feel free to add a couple drops of water to make sure the onions and the spices don't burn. Once the onions have softened a bit, go ahead and remove the bay leaves and the cinnamon stick. Next up, rather than making a garlic ginger paste, I'm going to mince up a 2 centimeter knob of ginger, as well as a few cloves of garlic. And throw those in. We'll be pureeing this later, so it's not that important to mince these too finely. And for a little bit of spice, throw in 3 sliced green chilies. Now we'll add some ground spices, 2 teaspoons each of Kashmiri chili and turmeric. Now let's season that with salt. Then add in about a half a cup of yogurt. I'm using Greek yogurt here for its thickness and tangy flavor, but feel free to use whatever you've got on hand as long as it's not the sugary kind. Mix that in, adding a little water to thin things out for easier distribution. Then dump the whole thing into a food processor or blender. Add in a cup of cashews. I'm using roasted ones to accentuate the nuttiness, and blitz that up until it's totally smooth. I ended up adding a bit of water to get the right consistency, so feel free to adjust as needed. This is a very concentrated sauce, so it can handle quite a bit of dilution before it gets bland. Once it's completely smooth, I ran my korma through a sieve to get an even finer texture. This is totally optional, but I'm going for fancy date night haute cuisine rather than a hearty rustic meal. Bear in mind it's a lot of work, and I had to throw the strained bits back in the blender to make sure enough of the cashew flavor got through. And once it's all strained, go ahead and set this aside, and feel free to store this in the fridge for a few days if you want to prep ahead of time. Now let's move on to the gnocchi. I've got 2 potatoes here that weigh about 500 grams together. This will give me about 8 servings of gnocchi, so feel free to cut that in half if you want. Peel and dice the potatoes. Then throw them in a pot of cold water. Bring them to a boil and let them go for 10 minutes. Then strain them out and start mashing them with a fork. This would probably be easier with a potato ricer, but it was honestly not that hard. Now pile those into a mound, add 150 grams of flour, form a well in the middle, and add a cracked egg. Mix that well until a dough forms. Adding extra flour if it's too sticky. And once the dough is ready, divide that into 8 pieces. Now if you want to go rustic, for the classic pillow shape, roll each piece into a 15mm thick snake. Then divide with a bench scraper. It helps to flick the scraper a little bit to form them a little better. As for me, again, I'm going for a fine dining white tablecloth kind of vibe, so I'll roll each piece of dough into a 1.5 centimeter thick slab, cut it into a rectangle, then divide that into gnocchi cubes, because as we all know, cube equals fancy. By the way, this is pretty difficult to get perfectly cubic because the dough is soft and fluffy, but do your best and it'll still look pretty impressive. Now let's get a liter of water up to a rolling boil in a saucepan. Season it well with salt. And boil our gnocchi briefly, just until they float. It really takes no time at all, so keep a close eye on them. The good news is these keep pretty well on a plate while you're making your final preparations, so no need to rush into the next step. So strain those out and set them aside while we get a stick or 115 grams of butter melting in a frying pan over medium heat. Once it's melted, keep stirring while the butter starts foaming and sizzling. Eventually the color will change from white to yellow to golden brown. At this point we've got brown butter and it's time to throw in a few leaves of sage. This will season the butter and the sage leaves will become a crispy topping for our dish. So once the sage leaves become wilted and fragrant, remove them and add in the gnocchi. Brown the gnocchi on all 6 sides until golden brown and slightly crispy. At the same time, get a couple ladles of our korma going in a frying pan over medium heat. Once the gnocchi are crisped up, remove them to our korma. And stir to coat them and soak up the sauce for a couple minutes. Once they're sufficiently coated, we're ready to plate. I'd recommend spooning a couple ladles of the korma into a bowl, then strategically placing 6 of the gnocchi in the bowl. Finally, top it with the crispy sage leaves, and drizzle some of the sage butter around the bowl. It should look pretty effing fancy. Why hasn't this been done before? This is ridiculous. Normally a korma and most other South Asian curries are too powerful for any pasta to stand up to. I think that's why this isn't normally done. And once I was done boiling the gnocchi, I had a little taste test with the korma, and the gnocchi did not stand up to it. They were pretty bland, but once I crisped them up in the sage butter and added the sage butter and, more importantly, the crispy sage leaves, it just took the flavor through the roof. Yes, the korma is sharp, bold, and spicy, but it's beautifully rounded out by the powerful savory note from that sage. This is totally unexpected and definitely one of my new favorite things. So I hope you give it a try and let me know in the comments how it turns out. See you next time. Cheers.